a young boy battling cancer, approached a royal guard with awe in his eyes, not knowing that his quiet bravery would ignite a moment no one would ever forget. When the guard broke protocol and gently removed his hat, the entire crowd was moved to tears. Here's how it all unfolded. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow at the same time, we'll share another powerful story that highlights the unwavering bravery and discipline of the Royal Guard. You won't want to miss it. The morning mist clung to the wrought-iron gates of Buckingham Palace like a shroud, dissipating slowly as the first rays of autumn sunlight pierced through London's perpetual grey. It was the kind of crisp October morning that made tourists bundle deeper into their coats while reaching for their cameras, eager to capture the stoic figures standing guard at one of the world's most recognizable addresses. Guardsman Hugh Fairbanks had been standing at his post for exactly 47 minutes. His polished boots remained planted in the same precise position they had occupied since the changing of the guard. His scarlet tunic immaculate, despite the morning dew that had settled on everything else. The towering bearskin hat on his head cast a shadow over his weathered face, a face that had seen 3 tours of duty before being selected for this most ceremonial of roles. At 32, Fairbanks was older than most of his fellow guardsmen, but his military bearing was impeccable. His grey eyes, though fixed straight ahead, as protocol demanded, missed nothing. He had learned long ago to observe the world through his peripheral vision, to catalogue the faces that passed by without ever betraying the slightest hint of acknowledgement. The tourists came in waves, predictable as the tide. First, the early morning joggers who barely glanced his way, then the dedicated photographers who arrived before the crowds, seeking that perfect shot of British pageantry. Later would come the families, the school groups, the endless stream of visitors who saw him not as a person, but as a living monument to tradition. On this particular morning, however, something was different. A small group approached from the direction of St. James's Park, moving slower than the usual tourist pace. Fairbanks' trained eye picked up the details without shifting his gaze. A woman in her 30s, her brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, dark circles under her eyes, suggesting sleepless nights. She wore a thick wool coat that had seen better days, and her hands gripped the handles of a small wheelchair with the kind of white-knuckled intensity that spoke of countless similar journeys. In the wheelchair sat a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Henry Morrison, though Fairbanks didn't know his name yet, was fighting a battle that no child should ever have to face. His small frame seemed almost lost beneath a thick hospital blanket tucked around his legs, and a knit cap covered what had once been a full head of sandy brown hair. But it was his eyes that struck Fairbanks most bright, green and alive, with an intelligence and determination that seemed to burn brighter for all the darkness surrounding it. The boy's mother, Sarah Morrison, had been planning this trip for weeks. It had been Henry's idea, born during one of his longer stays at Great Ormond Street Hospital. Between treatments, when the nausea subsided enough for him to focus on something other than the constant ache in his bones, Henry would watch videos on his tablet about the Royal Guard. He became fascinated by their discipline, their ability to stand perfectly still for hours, their unwavering dedication to duty. "Mum," he had said one evening as she sat beside his hospital bed, "do you think they ever get scared? The guards, I mean. Do they ever want to run away?" Sarah had looked at her son, this brave little boy, who faced needles and chemotherapy with more courage than most adults could muster, and felt her heart break and swell with pride simultaneously. "I don't know, sweetheart. But I think being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what you have to do even when you are scared." Henry had nodded solemnly, processing this information with the seriousness of a child who had been forced to grow up too fast. "Like going to my treatments, exactly like that." Now, as they approached the palace gates, Sarah could see the determination in her son's face. This wasn't just a tourist visit for Henry, it was a pilgrimage, a chance to meet someone he saw as a kindred spirit in the art of standing strong in the face of adversity. The small group stopped about 10 feet from where Fairbanks stood. Sarah positioned Henry's wheelchair at an angle that would give him the best view of the guardsmen, while still maintaining a respectful distance. She had researched the protocols, ostensibly knowing that the guards were not supposed to interact with tourists, but she also knew that her son needed this moment, needed to see his hero up close. Henry sat forward in his wheelchair, his small hands gripping the armrests with an intensity that made his knuckles white. He studied Fairbanks with the focused attention of a scholar examining a rare manuscript. The guardsman's posture, the way he held his rifle, the absolute stillness of his position, every detail fascinated the young boy. "He's been standing there for ages, Mum," Henry whispered, his voice filled with awe. "Look at how straight his back is, and his hat, it's so tall. How does he keep it from falling off?" Sarah followed her son's gaze, seeing the guardsman through Henry's eyes. She had to admit there was something impressive about the man's bearing, something that spoke of discipline and dedication that went far beyond mere performance. This wasn't just a job for him, it was a calling. Other tourists began to gather, drawn by the same magnetic pull that had attracted Henry. Cameras clicked softly, phones were raised to capture selfies, and the usual chatter of sightseers filled the air. But Henry remained focused on Fairbanks, watching him with the intensity of someone studying a master at work. Fairbanks, for his part, was acutely aware of the boy's presence. Something about the child's stillness, the way he watched without the restless energy typical of most young visitors, caught his attention. Through his peripheral vision, he could see the wheelchair, the hospital blanket, the way the boy's mother hovered protectively nearby. He had seen enough in his military career to recognize the signs of serious illness, and something in his chest tightened at the realization. The guardsman's thoughts drifted briefly to his own nephew, Jamie, who was just a year older than this boy. Jamie lived with Fairbanks' sister in Manchester, a normal, healthy child who complained about homework and spent his weekends playing football with his friends. The contrast wasn't lost on him. Here was a child who would probably give anything for such ordinary concerns. That as the morning wore on, the crowd around them grew and shifted, tourists coming and going in the endless cycle of London sightseeing. But Henry remained patient and watchful, content to simply observe. His mother began to worry about the cold, about keeping him out too long. But every time she suggested they move on, Henry would ask for just a few more minutes. "I'm learning, Mum," he said quietly. "I'm learning how to be still like him." It was then that Henry noticed something that made his heart race with excitement. Fairbanks' left hand, the one not holding his rifle, moved almost imperceptibly. Just a slight adjustment of his grip, but to Henry, who had been watching with such focused attention, it was like seeing a statue come to life. "Did you see that?" Henry whispered urgently to his mother. "He moved his hand, just a little bit, but I saw it." Sarah looked at the guardsman, seeing nothing but the same rigid posture he had maintained all morning. But she trusted her son's observational skills. The chemotherapy might have weakened his body, but it had done nothing to dull his sharp mind. "What does that mean?" she asked. Henry considered this question with the seriousness of a military strategist. "I think it means he's human," he said finally. "I think it means he gets tired too, but he keeps going anyway." The observation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Here was her 8-year-old son, fighting cancer with a courage that amazed everyone who met him, finding inspiration in the smallest sign of human frailty, overcome by determination. She had to turn away for a moment, blinking back tears that threatened to overwhelm her. By the time the clock struck 11, Henry had been watching Fairbanks for nearly 2 hours. The autumn chill had deepened, and Sarah could see that her son was beginning to tire. The medications he took made him more sensitive to cold, and despite the thick blanket and warm clothes, she could see him beginning to shiver slightly. "We should probably head back to the hotel," she said gently, placing a hand on Henry's shoulder. "You need to rest before your appointment this afternoon." Henry nodded reluctantly, but then a thought seemed to strike him. He looked up at his mother with an expression she recognized, the same look he got when he was about to ask for something he knew might be impossible. "Mum," he said quietly, "do you think I could ask him something? Just one question." Sarah's heart clenched. She knew the rules about not disturbing the guards, knew that they were trained to maintain their stoic silence no matter what, but she also knew that her son's time was precious, that every moment of joy and wonder was a gift that might not come again. "What would you want to ask him?" she said carefully. Henry's eyes lit up with an idea that had been forming in his mind all morning. "I want to tell him about my treatments, about how I practice standing still even when the chemo hurts, about how I try to be brave like him." The simple honesty of it, the desire to share his own struggle with someone he saw as a fellow warrior, made Sarah's decision for her. Protocol be damned if her son wanted to speak to the guardsman. She would make it happen. "All right," she said, her voice steady, despite the emotions churning inside her. "But we have to be respectful. If he can't respond, we'll understand." Henry nodded eagerly, his fatigue momentarily forgotten in his excitement. Sarah wheeled him closer to where Fairbanks stood, close enough to speak without raising their voices, but still maintaining a respectful distance. "Excuse me, sir," Henry said, his young voice clear and polite. "I know you're not supposed to talk to people, but I wanted to tell you something." Fairbanks felt every muscle in his body tense. This was exactly the kind of situation his training had prepared him for well-meaning tourists who wanted to engage, to break through the ceremonial barrier that separated him from the world. The correct response was to remain silent, to maintain his position and let the moment pass. But something about the boy's voice, the earnest politeness of his approach, made Fairbanks hesitate. Through his peripheral vision, he could see Henry looking up at him with those bright green eyes, waiting patiently for some kind of acknowledgement. "My name is Henry," the boy continued, undeterred by the guardsman's silence. "I'm 8 years old, and I have leukemia. That means I have to go to the hospital a lot for medicine that makes me feel really sick." Sarah closed her eyes, both proud of her son's courage and terrified of what this moment might cost him if it went wrong. Around them, other tourists had begun to take notice, sensing that something unusual was happening. "But I've been watching you," Henry went on, "and I've been practicing standing very still, like you do. Even when the chemo hurts, even when I want to cry or run away, I try to remember how you stand there so straight and strong." The words hit Fairbanks like a physical blow. Here was this child, this brave little boy fighting a battle that would challenge the strongest adult, drawing inspiration from what he saw as Fairbanks' strength. The guardsman felt something crack inside his chest, some carefully constructed wall of professional detachment crumbling in the face of such honest courage. Henry paused, gathering his strength for what he wanted to say next. "I wanted to ask you something, sir, do you think? Do you think I could try on your hat, just for a second? I promise I'll be very careful with it." The request hung in the air like a challenge to everything Fairbanks had been trained to believe about duty and protocol. The bearskin hat was not just a piece of uniform, it was a symbol of centuries of military tradition, a sacred trust passed down through generations of guardsmen. It was never to be removed during duty hours, never to be handled by civilians, never to be treated as anything other than the solemn emblem of service it represented. But as Fairbanks looked down at Henry, looked at him for the first time, he saw something that transcended all the rules and regulations that had governed his life. He saw a young soldier fighting a war that no child should have to fight, asking not for pity or special treatment, but for a moment of connection with someone he saw as a fellow warrior. The crowd around them had grown silent, sensing the gravity of the moment. Tourists who had been chattering and taking photos just moments before now stood in hushed anticipation, instinctively understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Fairbanks made his decision, with movements that seemed to occur in slow motion. He reached up and removed his bearskin hat. The action was so unprecedented, so completely outside the realm of normal protocol, that several people in the crowd gasped audibly. Sarah felt tears spraying to her eyes as she watched this man, this stranger, choose compassion over regulation. The guardsman's hair was revealed to be a military short brown, slightly dampened with sweat from the morning's duty. Without his towering hat, he seemed somehow more human, more approachable. Though his bearing remained unmistakably that of a soldier. Fairbanks knelt down beside Henry's wheelchair, bringing himself to eye level with the boy. Up close, he could see the evidence of Henry's battle more clearly, the slight yellowing of his skin from the medications, the way his hospital gown showed beneath his coat, the small bandage on his hand where an IV had recently been removed. "Guardsman Henry," Fairbanks said, his voice gentle but carrying the authority of his rank. "By the authority vested in me by Her Majesty's Household Division, I would be honored to share this symbol of service with a fellow soldier." The formal words, spoken with such sincerity and respect, transformed the moment from a simple gesture into something approaching a military ceremony. Henry's eyes widened with wonder and disbelief as Fairbanks carefully placed the massive bearskin hat on his small head. The hat was far too large for Henry, settling down over his ears and nearly covering his eyes. But the boy's smile was radiant, a beam of pure joy that seemed to light up the entire courtyard. He sat up as straight as his weakened body would allow, trying to embody the same dignity and bearing he had observed in Fairbanks. "How do I look, Mum?" Henry asked, his voice slightly muffled by the hat but vibrant with excitement. Sarah was crying openly now, not caring who saw her tears. "You look like a proper guardsman," she managed to say through her emotion. "You look perfect." The crowd around them had begun to applaud, a soft recognition of the beauty of the moment they had just witnessed. But Fairbanks wasn't finished. From his pocket, he produced a small ceremonial pinther, same kind given to new recruits when they first joined the regiment. It was a simple thing, really, just a bit of metal and enamel, but it represented something far more significant: belonging, recognition, acceptance into a brotherhood of service. "This pin," Fairbanks explained, as he carefully attached it to Henry's hospital gown, "is given to soldiers who have shown exceptional courage in the face of adversity. I can think of no one more deserving of it than you, Guardsman Henry." Henry reached up with trembling fingers to touch the pin, his small face serious with the weight of the honor being bestowed upon him. "Thank you, sir," he whispered. "I promise I'll be worthy of it." The moment stretched on, suspended in time, like a photograph that would be burned into the memories of everyone present. Fairbanks remained kneeling beside Henry's wheelchair, his own military bearing somehow enhanced rather than diminished by this act of humanity. The bearskin hat, so imposing and formal on the guardsman's head, seemed to transform Henry into something magical, a small boy playing dress-up. Yes, but also a young warrior being formally recognized for his courage. "Now," Fairbanks said, his voice carrying the tone of a drill instructor, but softened with warmth, "let's see if you remember how to salute properly. Right hand up, fingers straight and together, just like this." He demonstrated the movement with crisp precision, his hand moving from his side to his temple in one fluid motion. Henry watched intently, then attempted to mirror the gesture. His movement was slower, less precise than Fairbanks', but it carried something else, a determination that spoke of countless hours of practice, of a child who had studied these movements with the dedication of a scholar. "Outstanding, Guardsman," Fairbanks said, returning the salute with military precision. "You've clearly been practicing." The exchange of salutes seemed to complete some invisible circuit, connecting these two soldiers across the vast divide of age, experience, and circumstance. In that moment, they were not guardsman and tourist, adult and child, healthy and sick. They were simply two warriors, acknowledging each other's courage as the crowd around them continued to applaud. Fairbanks caught sight of a familiar figure, approaching through the gathering of tourists. Palace equerry James Whitmore was making his way toward them, his face a mask of concern and official displeasure. Fairbanks had been expecting this. His breach of protocol would not go unnoticed by the palace hierarchy. But as Whitmore drew closer and got a clear view of the scene before him, his expression changed. The stern disapproval melted away, replaced by something that looked very much like wonder. Here was a senior palace official, a man who had spent his career managing the intricate details of royal protocol, witnessing something that transcended all the rules and regulations he had spent his life enforcing. Instead of the sharp reprimand Fairbanks had been expecting, Whitmore simply stopped and watched. After a moment, he too began to applaud, adding his recognition to the growing appreciation of the crowd. Henry, still wearing the massive bearskin hat, looked around at all the faces watching him with expressions of warmth and admiration. For a child who had spent so much of his young life being looked at with pity and concern, this moment of being seen as something heroic was overwhelming. "I feel like a real soldier," he whispered to his mother, his voice filled with awe. Sarah, still crying, reached out to adjust the hat slightly so Henry could see better. "You are a real soldier, sweetheart. You're the bravest soldier I know." The weight of the moment seemed to settle on everyone present. This wasn't just a kind gesture from a guardsman to a sick child. It was a recognition of courage, a passing of the torch from one generation of warriors to the next. The ceremonial aspects of military life, often dismissed as mere pageantry, suddenly revealed their deeper purpose: to honor bravery wherever it was found, to connect past and present in an unbroken chain of service and sacrifice. Fairbanks began to sense that the moment was drawing to a close. As much as he wanted to continue, he had duties to return to, and Henry clearly needed rest. But there was one more thing he wanted to do, one final gesture that would complete this impromptu ceremony. "Guardsman Henry," he said formally, "it has been an honor to serve alongside you today. When you return to your battles, remember that you carry with you the respect and admiration of the entire regiment. We are proud to call you one of our own." The formal words, spoken with the gravity of a battlefield commendation, seemed to transform Henry in that moment. Despite his small size, despite the illness that had weakened his body, he sat straighter in his wheelchair, his chin lifted with a dignity that would have been impressive in a soldier twice his age. "Thank you," Sir Henry replied, his voice stronger than it had been all morning. "I won't let you down." Fairbanks slowly reached out and carefully lifted the bearskin hat from Henry's head, his movements reverent and precise. The hat had left Henry's hair slightly mussed, and his mother reached out to smooth it down, her touch gentle and loving. As Fairbanks placed the hat back on his own head, settling it into its proper position, he seemed to transform back into the stoic guardsman he had been all morning. But something had changed. There was a softness around his eyes, a warmth that hadn't been there before. The crowd began to disperse slowly, many of them wiping away tears, all of them carrying with them the memory of what they had witnessed. This was the kind of moment that would be shared in phone calls to family members, posted on social media, remembered and retold for years to come. But for Henry, the moment was far from over. As his mother prepared to wheel him away, he reached out and tugged at her sleeve. "Mum," he said quietly, "I want to write him a letter. When we get back to the hotel, I want to write a proper letter to thank him." Sarah nodded, understanding the importance of this gesture for her son. "Of course, sweetheart, we'll write it together." As they began to move away from the palace gates, Henry twisted in his wheelchair to look back at Fairbanks, who had resumed his position and his stoic expression. The guardsman's eyes flickered briefly toward the departing boy, and for just a moment, their gazes met across the growing distance. Henry raised his hand in a small wave, and though Fairbanks couldn't respond overtly, Henry thought he saw the slightest nod of acknowledgement, a secret message between two soldiers who had found something in each other that transcended the boundaries of their very different battles. The journey back to their hotel was quiet. Henry lost in thought as he processed the magnitude of what had just occurred. The ceremonial pin was still attached to his hospital gown, catching the light as they moved through the London streets. He touched it frequently, as if to reassure himself that the entire experience hadn't been a dream. That evening, in their modest hotel room near the hospital, Henry sat at the small writing desk with a pad of paper and a pen, his brow furrowed, in concentration as he carefully composed his letter. His handwriting was shaky, a side effect of his medications, but his words were clear and heartfelt. "Dear Mr. Guardsman," he began, then paused, realizing he didn't know the man's name. "I don't know your name, but I want to thank you for today. You made me feel like a real soldier, like someone who could be brave, even when things are scary." He wrote about his treatments, about the long nights in the hospital, about how he had watched videos of the Royal Guard to help him find the courage to face each day. He wrote about how seeing Fairbanks' discipline and dedication had inspired him to be strong, even when his body felt weak. "I'm going to keep practicing standing still," he wrote near the end of the letter, "and I'm going to wear my pin to all my treatments from now on. Thank you for making me feel like a hero, even though I'm just a kid with cancer." The letter, when finished, was 3 pages longer, remarkable feat for a child dealing with the effects of chemotherapy. Sarah helped him fold it carefully and place it in an envelope, which Henry insisted on addressing himself despite his shaking hands. The next morning, they delivered the letter to the palace gates, where a different guardsman stood at attention. Sarah explained the situation to a palace official, who promised that the letter would be delivered to the appropriate person. They had no way of knowing if it would ever reach Fairbanks, but the act of writing it had been important to Henry, a way of completing the circle of connection that had begun the day before. Meanwhile, Fairbanks had returned to his barracks that evening to find himself the center of attention in a way he had never experienced before. Word of his gesture had spread throughout the regiment, and his fellow guardsmen approached him with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. "Was it worth it?" asked Corporal Davies, a younger man who had always been scrupulous about following protocol. "I mean, they're going to have to discipline you for breaking procedure." Fairbanks considered the question as he cleaned his rifle, a nightly ritual that helped him process the events of each day. "There are rules," he said finally, "and then there are things that are right. Sometimes they're the same thing, sometimes they're not." The expected summons to the commanding officer's office came the next morning. Colonel Richardson was a career military man who had served in 3 different conflicts before taking command of the Palace Guard. His office was filled with the kinds of ceremonial objects that spoke to decades of service: medals, commendations, photographs of royal events. "Guardsman Fairbanks," the colonel began, his voice carrying the weight of military authority. "I assume you know why you're here." "Yes, sir. I breached protocol yesterday morning by removing my bearskin hat while on duty and allowing a civilian to wear it." "That's correct. And do you understand that such behavior is completely contrary to the standards we maintain as representatives of the Crown?" Fairbanks stood at attention, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall behind the colonel's head. "Yes, sir, I understand." Colonel Richardson studied the younger man for a long moment, taking in his perfect posture, his unwavering gaze, the evidence of a soldier who had never before given his superiors cause for concern. "Tell me about the boy," the colonel said finally. The question seemed to catch Fairbanks off guard. He had been prepared for discipline, for a formal reprimand, perhaps even for dismissal from the palace guard. He had not been prepared for this request to explain his actions. "His name was Henry, sir. 8 years old. He's fighting leukemia." Fairbanks paused, searching for the right words. "He'd been watching me for nearly 2 hours, sir. Not like the tourists usually do, but like he was studying me, learning from me." The colonel nodded slowly, and you felt compelled to respond to that. "Sir, I have a nephew about his age. Healthy, normal boy, who complains about having to eat his vegetables." Fairbanks' voice grew quieter. "This child, Henry, he's fighting a battle that would break most adults, and he was finding strength in what he saw as my discipline, my ability to stand strong in the face of adversity. So you gave him your hat." "I gave him recognition, sir. I gave him a moment of feeling like the warrior he already was." Colonel Richardson walked to the window of his office, which looked out over the palace courtyard, where guardsmen like Fairbanks stood their daily posts. He had been commanding soldiers for nearly 30 years, and he had seen courage take many forms, but there was something about this story that resonated with him in a way that surprised him. "You know," he said, still facing the window, "when I was a young lieutenant in the Falklands, I once saw a sergeant give his rations to a group of local children who were hungry. It was against regulations. Those rations were strictly accounted for, and sharing them with civilians was prohibited." He turned back to face Fairbanks, who remained at attention. "But sometimes, guardsman, the spirit of service transcends the letter of the law. Sometimes being a soldier means recognizing that our duty extends beyond the specific orders we've been given." Fairbanks felt a flicker of hope, but he maintained his rigid posture. "That said," the colonel continued, "I cannot simply ignore a clear breach of protocol. The palace guard exists on the foundation of absolute discipline and adherence to procedure. If I let this slide without consequence, it could set a precedent that undermines everything we stand for." The hope in Fairbanks' chest began to dim. "Therefore, I am issuing you a formal reprimand for breach of protocol. It will go in your file, and you will be assigned extra duties for the next 2 weeks. The colonel paused, and a small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "However, I am also recommending you for a commendation for exceptional service to the community. Your actions yesterday embodied the finest traditions of the British Army, and I believe they deserve recognition." Fairbanks blinked, not sure he had heard correctly. "Sir, you see, guardsman, I received a phone call this morning from Buckingham Palace. It seems that a video of your interaction with young Henry has been circulating on social media. The palace has been inundated with positive responses from around the world. Her Majesty herself has expressed her approval of your actions." The colonel picked up a tablet from his desk and showed Fairbanks the screen. There, in high definition, was the moment when he had placed his bearskin hat on Henry's head. The video had been viewed millions of times, shared across every social media platform, and had generated thousands of comments from people expressing their admiration for both the guardsman's compassion and the little boy's courage. "It seems," the colonel continued, "that your breach of protocol has done more to enhance the reputation of the palace guard than any formal ceremony could have accomplished. The Public Relations Office is calling it the most humanizing moment in recent royal history." Fairbanks watched the video in amazement. Seeing himself and Henry from an outsider's perspective, the ceremony he had improvised looked even more meaningful captured on film. The moment when two very different kinds of soldiers had recognized each other's courage. "There's one more thing," the colonel said, reaching into his desk drawer. "This arrived for you this morning." He handed Fairbanks a small envelope, addressed in shaky handwriting to Mr. Guardsman. Inside was Henry's letter, with its heartfelt thanks and its promise to keep practicing standing still. As Fairbanks read the letter, something in his expression softened. Here was this brave little boy, facing battles that would challenge the strongest adults, writing to thank him for a moment of recognition and connection. "Sir," Fairbanks said after finishing the letter, "I'd like to write back to him. If that's possible, I'd like him to know that meeting him made me a better soldier." The colonel nodded approvingly. "I think that would be entirely appropriate, Guardsman. In fact, I think it would be an excellent example of the kind of community engagement we should be encouraging." That evening, Fairbanks sat in his small room in the barracks, composing his own letter to Henry. Writing had never been his strong suit. He was a man of action rather than words, but he felt compelled to respond to the boy's heartfelt message. "Dear Henry," he began, "thank you for your letter. It means more to me than you could possibly know. You wrote that I made you feel like a hero, but I want you to know that you are the one who showed me what true courage looks like." He wrote about his own struggles, about the times when standing at attention for hours seemed difficult, and how thinking of Henry's strength during his treatments would now make his own duties seem easier by comparison. "You asked me once if I ever get scared," he wrote. "The answer is yes, I do. But I've learned that being brave doesn't mean never being scared. It means doing what you need to do even when you are scared. And from what your mother tells me, you do that every single day." He told Henry about the other guardsmen who had heard his story, about how they had all been inspired by his courage. He wrote about the tradition of the ceremonial pin, about how it connected Henry to a long line of soldiers who had shown exceptional bravery in the face of adversity. "I want you to know," he concluded, "that whenever I'm standing at my post, I'll be thinking of you. Your courage gives me strength, and I hope that knowing you have an entire regiment of soldiers who consider you one of their own will give you strength to." The letter was delivered to Henry's hospital room the next day, where he was undergoing another round of chemotherapy. The nurses had decorated his room with get-well cards and drawings from other children. But Henry's face lit up with special joy when he saw the official palace letterhead. Sarah read the letter aloud to him as he lay in his hospital bed. The ceremonial pin pinned to his hospital gown. With each word, Henry's smile grew brighter, and by the end of the letter, he was sitting up straighter, despite his weakness. "He remembers me," Henry whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "He really remembers me." "Of course he remembers you," Sarah said, smoothing his hair. "How could anyone forget you?" The letter had an immediate effect on Henry's spirits. The nurses noticed that he complained less about his treatments, that he seemed to find reserves of strength he hadn't shown before. When asked about the change, Henry would point to the pin on his hospital gown and say, "I'm a guardsman now. Guardsmen don't give up." Word of the correspondence between Henry and Fairbanks reached the media, and soon requests for interviews began pouring in. Both families declined most of these requests, wanting to maintain some privacy during Henry's treatment, but they did agree to one interview with a respected children's charity, hoping that their story might inspire other young patients facing similar battles. The interview was conducted in Henry's hospital room, with Fairbanks participating via video call from the palace. Seeing each other again, even through a screen, clearly moved both of them. "How are you feeling, Guardsman Henry?" Fairbanks asked, his formal military bearing softened by genuine concern. "I'm doing good," Henry replied, unconsciously straightening his shoulders. "The doctors say my numbers are getting better. I think it's because I remember what you taught me about standing strong." The interviewer asked Fairbanks about his decision to break protocol, about whether he had any regrets. "None at all," Fairbanks replied firmly. "Meeting Henry reminded me why I became a soldier in the first place. It's not about the uniform or the ceremony, it's about service, about being there for people who need you." The interview aired on a Sunday evening, reaching millions of viewers across the United Kingdom and beyond. The response was overwhelming. The hospital received thousands of cards and letters for Henry, while the palace guard was flooded with expressions of support and admiration. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the interview aired, a package arrived at the palace, addressed to Guardsman Fairbanks. Inside was a small wooden box, beautifully carved and polished, with a note attached. The note was written in the shaky handwriting of an elderly person. "Dear Guardsman Fairbanks, my name is Albert Morrison. I am Henry's grandfather. I served in the Coldstream Guards during the Korean War, and I wanted you to have this. It belonged to my father, who served in the same regiment during World War II. He would have been proud to know that his legacy lived on in someone like you. Thank you for showing my grandson what it means to be a soldier." Inside the box was a small brass compass, tarnished with age but still functional. Engraved on the back were the words, "To find your way home, A. Morrison, 1943. It was a family heirloom, passed down through generations of soldiers, and now being gifted to a man who had shown kindness to a little boy fighting the battle of his life. Fairbanks held the compass in his hands, feeling the weight of its history. Here was a tangible connection to the past, to other soldiers who had faced their own battles with courage and determination. The gesture meant more to him than any official commendation could have. He immediately wrote back to Albert Morrison, expressing his gratitude and his promise to honor the gift. He also included a photo of himself with Henry, along with a copy of the letter Henry had written to him. The old soldier's response came quickly, filled with pride for his grandson and gratitude for the joy that Fairbanks had brought to the boy's difficult journey. As autumn deepened into winter, the correspondence between Henry and Fairbanks continued. Henry would write about his treatments, his good days and bad days, his hopes and fears. Fairbanks would respond with stories from his duties, observations about the tourists who came to see the palace, and always, reminders of Henry's courage and strength. The other guardsmen began to look forward to these letters as much as Fairbanks did. They would gather in the barracks to hear the latest updates on Henry's progress, celebrating his good days and offering their support during the more difficult times. The regiment had effectively adopted Henry as one of their own, and his battle became their battle on Henry's 9th birthday, which fell in December. The entire palace guard participated in a special ceremony. They recorded a video message for him, each guardsman taking turns to wish him well and to express their admiration for his courage. The video ended with Fairbanks, still wearing Henry's ceremonial pin on his own uniform, leading the regiment in a formal birthday salute. The video arrived at the hospital on Henry's birthday morning, and the nurses gathered to watch it with him. By the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Henry watched it 3 times, his face glowing with joy and pride. "They really think I'm one of them," he whispered to his mother, his voice filled with wonder. "You are one of them," Sarah replied, hugging him tightly. "You're the bravest soldier any of us have ever known." The winter months were difficult for Henry. His treatments intensified, and there were days when he was too weak to do much more than sleep. But even on his worst days, he would ask his mother to read him Fairbanks' letters, drawing strength from the guardsmen's words of encouragement and support. During this period, Fairbanks found himself thinking about Henry constantly. Standing at his post, he would imagine the little boy in his hospital bed, fighting battles that would challenge the strongest adults. The thought gave weight to his own duties, reminded him that his role as a guardian extended far beyond the palace gates. One particularly cold February morning, as Fairbanks stood at his post, he noticed a familiar figure approaching through the crowd of tourists. It was Sarah, Henry's mother, but she was alone. His heart clenched with fear as he realized what her solitary presence might mean. She approached him slowly, her face a mask of exhaustion and grief. Without speaking, she placed a small envelope at his feet, gave him a brief, sad smile, and walked away. Fairbanks couldn't break protocol to pick up the envelope immediately, but he could see from his peripheral vision that his name was written on it in Henry's distinctive handwriting. When his shift ended 2 hours later, Fairbanks retrieved the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter, shorter than Henry's usual correspondence, but written with the same careful attention to detail. "Dear Mr. Fairbanks," it began. "The doctors say I might not get better this time. I'm not scared though, because you taught me that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what you have to do even when you are scared." The letter went on to thank Fairbanks for everything he had done, for making him feel like a real soldier, for showing him what courage looked like. At the end, Henry had written, "I want you to have my pin back. I won't need it where I'm going, but I hope you'll remember me when you wear it." Attached to the letter was the ceremonial pin that Fairbanks had given Henry that day at the palace gates. It was slightly tarnished now, worn from months of being worn on hospital gowns and pajamas, but it seemed to glow with a special significance. Fairbanks read the letter 3 times before the full impact hit him. Then, for the first time since he had been a child, he sat down and cried. He cried for Henry, for the unfairness of a world where children had to fight such battles. He cried for Sarah, who was about to lose her son. And he cried for himself, for the hole that would be left in his own life when Henry was gone. The funeral was held on a grey March morning, with a gentle rain falling like tears from the sky. The church was packed with people whose lives Henry had touched: doctors and nurses from the hospital, teachers from his school, neighbors and friends who had watched his courageous battle. But perhaps the most remarkable sight was the presence of 12 guardsmen in full ceremonial dress, standing at attention at the back of the church. They had come to honor one of their own, to pay their respects to a young soldier who had shown them what true courage looked like. As the service concluded, the guardsmen formed an honor guard outside the church. As Henry's coffin was carried past them, they came to attention and rendered a final salute to their fallen comrade. It was a moment of profound dignity and respect, a military farewell for a boy who had earned his place among warriors. Fairbanks served as one of the pallbearers, carrying Henry's small coffin with the same precision and care he brought to his duties at the palace. Pinned to his uniform was Henry's ceremonial pin, polished to a brilliant shine, a permanent reminder of the boy who had taught him about courage. In the weeks that followed, Fairbanks found it difficult to return to his normal duties. Standing at his post, he would think about Henry, about the hours the boy had spent watching him, learning from him. The tourists who came to see the palace guards had no idea that they were looking at a man who had been profoundly changed by his encounter with a brave little boy. But gradually, Fairbanks began to find a new purpose in his role. He started to pay more attention to the children in the crowds, to the way they looked at him with wonder and admiration. He began to understand that his position was about more than just ceremony and tradition. It was about inspiration, about showing people what strength and dedication looked like. He never broke protocol again, but he carried himself with a new awareness of the impact he could have on others. When he stood at his post, he thought about Henry watching him, learning from him, and he tried to embody the same courage and determination that the little boy had shown in his own battle. The story of Henry and Fairbanks became something of a legend within the palace guard. New recruits would hear about the guardsman who had given his hat to a dying boy, about the courage of a child who had faced his illness with the bearing of a soldier. It became a reminder that their role extended beyond the ceremonial, that they were guardians not just of a building or a tradition, but of the values that made their service meaningful. Years later, when Fairbanks was promoted to sergeant and then to sergeant major, he would tell new guardsmen about Henry. He would explain that their duty was not just to stand at attention and follow protocol, but to embody the kind of strength and courage that could inspire others to face their own battles. The compass that Henry's grandfather had given him sat on Fairbanks' desk, a constant reminder of the legacy he had inherited and the responsibility he carried. Sometimes, when the weight of his duties felt overwhelming, he would hold it in his hands and remember a brave little boy who had found strength in watching him stand at his post. Henry's story lived on in other ways too. The hospital where he had been treated established a fund in his name, providing support for other young patients facing similar battles. The ceremonial pin that had meant so much to him was displayed in a case in the children's ward, along with a photo of him wearing Fairbanks' bearskin hat. Sarah, Henry's mother, would sometimes visit the palace gates. Standing in the spot where her son had first approached Fairbanks, she would watch the current guardsmen with the same admiration Henry had shown, remembering the day when one of them had chosen compassion over protocol and had given her son a moment of pure joy. The video of Henry wearing the bearskin hat continued to circulate on social media, viewed by millions of people around the world. It became a symbol of hope and courage, a reminder that bravery came in many forms, and that sometimes the smallest gestures could have the most profound impact. And in the end, that was Henry's greatest victory, not over his illness, which had ultimately claimed his young life, but over despair and meaninglessness. He had shown that even in the face of overwhelming odds, it was possible to find courage, to inspire others, and to leave a legacy that would outlast any individual life. The guardsman who had given his hat to a little boy fighting cancer had learned that some moments are too important for protocol, that some connections transcend the boundaries of duty and regulation, and in return, he had been given a gift that would last a lifetime, the knowledge that courage, real courage, could be found in the most unexpected places, embodied by the bravest of hearts. Standing at his post now, older and wiser, Fairbanks would sometimes catch glimpses of Henry in the faces of other children who came to watch the changing of the guard. In their wonder and admiration, he saw the same spirit that had driven a sick little boy to spend hours watching him, learning from him, drawing strength from his example. And in those moments, he knew that Henry's battle had not been in vain, that his courage had created ripples that would continue to spread long after he was gone. The little boy who had wanted to be a guardsman had become something even more important. He had become a guardian of hope, a reminder that in a world that could often seem dark and overwhelming, there was always room for compassion, for connection, for the kind of courage that could transform both the giver and the receiver. The story would be told and retold, passed down through generations of guardsmen, each one carrying with them the memory of a brave little boy who had shown them what true strength looked like. And in that way, Henry would live on not just in the hearts of those who had known him, but in the very tradition he had so admired, a permanent part of the legacy of courage that defined the guardians of the palace gates. In the end, perhaps, that was the most fitting tribute of all, that a child who had faced his greatest battle with the bearing of a soldier would be remembered not for his illness, but for his courage, not for his weakness, but for his strength, and that his brief encounter with a guardsman would remind everyone who heard the story that sometimes the most profound acts of service happen not in grand gestures, but in simple moments of human connection, when one person chooses to see the courage in another and honors it with the recognition it deserves.